The wind doesn't just blow on the high ridge, it whispers. They told me Silas Vance was a man made of stone and winter frost, a man who had forgotten the sound of his own name. When my father traded my hand to settle a debt, the townspeople watched me leave like I was walking into my own grave. They expected a tragedy. They expected the mountain to swallow me whole. But the man waiting in the shadows of the pines wasn't the monster they described. He held a secret that would change the frontier forever. This is how I lost my life in the valley and found my soul on the peaks.
Welcome back to Rescued by the Ridge. Today's story is a journey of survival and the hidden heart of the Old West. If you find peace in these tales of the wild, please subscribe and hit the bell. Your support helps us keep these forgotten spirits alive. Now let's travel back to 1874. The air in Cedar Creek felt heavy that morning. It wasn't just the coming snow. It was the weight of a silence that sat on every porch and every storefront. My father, Thomas Penrose, sat at our small kitchen table with his head in his hands. He was a good man, but a man out of time. He had come west to build a mercantile empire, yet all he found was dust and bad luck. The ledger lay open between us. The ink was red and the numbers were cold. We owed the town council for the winter seeds and the cattle feed. In a settlement this small, a debt isn't just a business matter. It's a matter of life or death. If we didn't pay, we would be cast out into the wilderness before the first frost. I remember the way the floorboards creaked when the town elder, Silas's messenger, stepped inside. He didn't come with a bill. He came with a proposal. "There is a man on the high ridge," the messenger said. His voice was low, like gravel grinding together. "Silas Vance. He controls the upper passes. He knows where the spring water flows and where the timber is strongest. He needs a wife to keep his hearth, and in exchange, he will clear the town's debt and guide the supply wagons through the winter." My heart went cold. Everyone knew the stories of Silas Vance. They called him the Stone. They said he hadn't spoken to a soul in 10 years. They said he had turned his back on humanity because he no longer felt like a part of it. He was a giant of a man who lived among the wolves and the eagles. My father looked at me, his eyes wet with a shame he couldn't hide. He didn't have to say it. I was the last thing he had left to trade. In the 1870s, a marriage wasn't always about a white dress and a church bell. Out here, on the edge of the world, it was a contract. It was a way to survive. I stood up, smoothing my apron, trying to keep my hands from shaking. I looked out the window toward the jagged peaks of the mountains. They looked like teeth against the gray sky. "I will go," I whispered. I packed one small trunk with my mother's Bible, a tin of dried lavender, and my warmest shawl. 2 days later, a heavy wagon pulled by 2 black horses stopped in front of our gate. The driver didn't get down. He just sat there, cloaked in furs, his face hidden by the brim of a wide hat. I climbed up into the seat, and without a single word of greeting, he flicked the reins. As the wheels began to turn, I looked back at the town. I didn't know then that the man sitting beside me was about to shock everyone, including me. The town of Cedar Creek vanished behind a veil of gray mist within the first hour. The rhythmic thud-thud of the horses' hooves became the only heartbeat in a world that felt increasingly empty. Beside me, the man they called the Stone remained a mystery wrapped in heavy buffalo robes. He didn't look at me. He didn't ask if I was cold. He simply stared at the trail ahead with eyes that seemed to see things I couldn't. Shifts in the wind, the subtle movements of the brush, and the gathering clouds above. As the wagon began the steep climb, the air changed. It grew thin and sharp, tasting of pine resin and ancient earth. This was the high ridge, a place most settlers feared. In the 1800s, moving upward meant leaving behind the safety of the valley's oxygen and warmth. For every 1,000 feet we climbed, the temperature dropped significantly. It was a lesson in mountain geography I was learning through the shivering of my own bones. I watched Silas's hands as he worked the reins. They were immense, calloused, and stained with the dark oils of the forest. Yet he held the leather straps with a surprising lightness. He wasn't fighting the horses. He was communicating with them. It was my first glimpse into his true nature. In the wilderness, brute force often fails, but understanding the rhythm of your environment keeps you alive. The trail narrowed until it was little more than a ledge of rock and packed dirt. To our left, the mountain went up forever. To our right, it dropped away into a canyon filled with shadows. My breath hitched in my throat. One wrong move from the horses would send us into the abyss. I reached out to grab the side of the wagon, my knuckles white. Suddenly, for the first time, Silas moved. He didn't speak, but he reached over and placed one heavy gloved hand over mine. He didn't squeeze, he just held it there, steadying my trembling. His hand was like a heated brick through the leather. It was a silent promise of safety. As the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon, the sky turned a bruised purple. Silas finally pulled the horses to a halt near a natural rock outcropping. He hopped down with a grace that didn't match his size and began to unhitch the team. He pointed toward a small, sheltered hollow under the stones, and then to a bundle of dry wood he had stored in the back of the wagon. I realized then that our survival tonight depended on fire and shelter. This wasn't a journey of comfort. It was an education in the raw elements. I climbed down, my legs wobbly, and watched as he struck a piece of flint against steel. A shower of sparks fell into a nest of dry grass. In seconds, a small flame danced to life. I sat by the fire, watching the man who was now my husband. He was still a stranger, but as he handed me a tin cup of water he had warmed over the flames, I saw his face clearly in the firelight. He wasn't the monster the town had described. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had carried the weight of the mountains on his shoulders for far too long. Just as I prepared to settle in for the night, a long, mournful howl echoed through the canyon. My blood turned to ice. Silas didn't flinch. He looked up at the moon, then turned his gaze toward me, his eyes reflecting the orange embers of the fire. "They aren't singing for you, Clara," he said. It was the first time I had heard his voice. It was deep, like the vibration of a cello, and it sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the cold.
The sound of his voice lingered in the cold air long after the echoes of the wolves faded. It wasn't the voice of a savage. It was the voice of a man who spoke only when the words were worth the breath. That night I slept fitfully under a mountain of wool blankets, tucked into the bed of the wagon, while Silas sat by the fire, a silent sentinel against the dark. When the sun rose, it didn't just bring light, it brought a blinding, golden clarity. We continued our ascent until the trees began to thin, giving way to the rugged, wind-swept heights of the ridge. Then, tucked into a natural fold of the mountain, I saw it. I had expected a hovel, a dark, damp hole where a beast might live. Instead, Silas pulled the horses to a stop before a cabin that looked like it had grown straight out of the earth. It was built of massive, hand-hewn logs, notched together with a precision that would have made the finest carpenters in the East weep with envy. "Step down," Silas said, offering a hand that felt as steady as the mountain itself. As I crossed the threshold, the sound hit me first. It wasn't the scent of old grease or wood smoke. It smelled of dried lavender, cedar, and beeswax. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I gasped. Along the far wall stood floor-to-ceiling shelves, hand-carved and sturdy, but they weren't filled with pelts or iron traps. They were filled with books, thick leather-bound volumes on philosophy, botany, and engineering. In the corner sat a desk with a small inkwell and a stack of parchment. To the left was a massive stone hearth built with a Rumford design, a clever bit of 18th century engineering meant to reflect heat back into the room rather than letting it escape up the chimney. This wasn't a cave, it was a sanctuary of intellect. "You read?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper as I touched the spine of a book on medicinal plants. Silas was busy hauling my trunk inside. He paused, his large frame silhouetted against the bright snow outside. "The world down there has enough noise, Clara. Up here, I prefer the thoughts of men who have something better to say than the gossip in Cedar Creek." He walked over to a heavy wooden table and set down a bowl of fresh pine needles and a small jar of honey. "The climb was hard on your lungs," he noted, his observation keen. "Steep elevations can thin the blood and tire the heart. Drink this tea. It will help your body adjust to the heights." I watched him move with a surprising gentleness. He wasn't the man they feared. He was a man who had mastered the art of living where others only survived. But as I looked at the single bed in the loft and the isolation of the peak, a new fear took hold. I was miles from another human soul, tied to a man who lived in a world of silence and shadows. "Why me, Silas? Why bring a wife up here to this lonely place?" He stopped and looked at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Then he pointed to a small, delicate flower sitting in a glass of water on the windowsill, a mountain primrose, blooming despite the cold. "Because even the strongest ridge," he said softly, "is barren without something to care for." Then he turned and walked back out into the cold, leaving me alone in a house of secrets, wondering just who this feared man really was.
The first few weeks on the high ridge were a lesson in a different kind of existence. In the valley, time was measured by the town clock and the ringing of the church bell. Up here, time was dictated by the angle of the sun and the shifting behavior of the mountain's inhabitants. Silas didn't use many words, but he began to teach me a language that required no voice. One morning, he beckoned me to the porch. The air was so cold it felt like needles in my throat. He pointed toward a group of birds, mountain chickadees, huddling deep within the thickest pine branches. He then gestured to the sky, where the blue was so deep it almost looked black. "Watch the feathers, Clara," he said quietly. "When the birds seek the heart of the tree and the smoke from the chimney drops toward the ground, the pressure is falling. A heavy sky means a heavy heart for the mountain. We must prepare." I realized he wasn't just a hermit, he was a scholar of the natural world. He was teaching me the science of barometric pressure before I even knew the word for it. In the 1870s, knowing how to read the signs was the difference between a warm hearth and a frozen grave. We spent the day moving with a shared purpose. We hauled extra cords of seasoned cedar into the lean-to and checked the chinking between the cabin logs. Silas showed me how they used a mixture of mud, straw, and animal hair to create a seal against the wind. It was a humble form of insulation, but it turned our home into a fortress of warmth. As we worked, I noticed the way Silas moved. He was deliberate. He never wasted emotion. He treated every tool and every piece of wood with a quiet respect, as if he knew the history of every tree he had felled. Inside the cabin, my education continued. He didn't expect me to be a servant. He expected me to be a partner. He showed me his collection of dried fungi, specifically the tinderhoof fungus. He explained how the pioneers used its inner layers to carry fire from one camp to another, as it could smolder for hours without extinguishing.
"The mountain provides everything," he remarked as he polished a hand-carved wooden bowl, "but it only gives to those who know how to ask." I began to see that his fearful reputation in town likely came from his independence. People often fear what they cannot control or understand. To the folks in Cedar Creek, a man who didn't need their gossip or their gold was a threat. To me, he was becoming something else entirely. That evening, as the first flakes of the predicted storm began to drift past the window, the silence between us didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like a shared secret. But as the wind began to howl, a different sound joined it, a low, rhythmic thumping against the heavy oak door. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. Silas stood up, his face hardening, and reached for a heavy iron bar to secure the latch. "Stay back, Clara," he warned. The beast of the ridge was back, but this time the threat was coming from the outside. The thumping against the door grew more frantic as the wind began to scream through the eaves. Silas moved with a sudden, fluid speed, positioning himself between me and the entrance. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he gripped the heavy iron bolt, his muscles tensing like coiled rope. When he finally threw the door open, a wall of white powder swirled into the room, and with it, a massive shape collapsed onto the floorboards. It wasn't a predator, but a stag, a magnificent creature, its antlers tangled in a mess of frozen vines and heavy ice that had weighted it down until it could no longer run. It had sought the only shelter it could find, the lee of our cabin. Silas didn't hesitate. "The ice is sealing its breath," he commanded, his voice sharp but calm. "Clara, fetch the warm vinegar and the heavy shears from the workbench." In that moment, the educational reality of the frontier became clear. Survival wasn't just about the humans, it was about the ecosystem we shared. If the wildlife perished, the mountain would die, and we would follow. I watched as Silas knelt in the freezing draft, his giant hands moving with the precision of a surgeon. He wasn't harming the animal, he was liberating it. He carefully clipped away the ice-laden vines that had frozen to the stag's hide, explaining in a low murmur that the weight of the ice causes cold shock, where the animal's heart begins to fail from the sheer energy required to stay upright. Once the stag was freed and pushed back into the sheltered lean-to we had built for the horses, Silas slammed the door shut against the burgeoning great freeze. This wasn't just a storm, it was a climactic event. Outside, the temperature was plummeting toward 40 below zero. At those temperatures, exposed skin can freeze in minutes, a condition known as frostnip, leading to frostbite. "We must bank the fire," Silas whispered, his breath visible even inside. He showed me how to use the ash capping technique. By burying the glowing red embers under a thick layer of fine gray ash, we could starve the fire of just enough oxygen to keep it smoldering for 12 hours without burning through our precious cordwood. As the night deepened, the cabin groaned under the weight of the mounting snow. We sat huddled near the hearth, the only circle of warmth in a world turned to ice. I looked at Silas, his face illuminated by the flickering orange light. He had saved a life that offered him nothing in return. "The town calls you a monster, Silas," I said softly. He looked at the embers, his expression solemn. "People call you what they need you to be so they can feel better about themselves. In the valley, they need a ghost to fear. Up here, I just need to be a man who survives." But as the wind reached a terrifying crescendo, a different kind of chill settled in my chest. I looked at my hands and realized they were pale, a strange blue tint touching my fingernails. The great freeze had found a way in, and the true test of our endurance was only just beginning. The blue tint on my fingernails wasn't just a trick of the firelight. It was the mark of the mountain's bite.
Despite the thick logs and the banked fire, the great freeze had turned the cabin into a beautiful wooden icebox. I felt a strange, heavy lethargy pulling at my limbs, a dangerous sign of early-stage hypothermia. When the body's core temperature drops, it begins to pull blood away from the extremities to protect the vital organs. My mind felt clouded, like a window frosting over. Silas noticed before I could even speak. He didn't panic. He moved with the steady focus of a man who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. "The cold is in your blood, Clara," he said, his voice a calm anchor in my drifting consciousness. He didn't just wrap me in blankets. He knew that stagnant warmth wouldn't be enough. He rushed to the shelves I had admired earlier, but he didn't grab a book of poetry. He pulled down a ceramic jar filled with dried golden gray roots and a bundle of what looked like inner tree bark. "In the 1800s, Silas murmured as he worked, "those who didn't understand the land called this mountain magic, but it's simply what the earth provides." He began to brew a pungent tea. He explained that he was using ginger root to stimulate circulation and white willow bark, which contains salicin, a natural precursor to what we now know as aspirin. He sat beside me, supporting my head as I took small, painful sips. The heat felt like a jagged blade at first, but slowly the internal furnace began to relight. As he tended to me, he spoke about the medicinal properties of the high ridge. He showed me how he prepared yarrow to stop bleeding and pine resin to create antiseptic salves. This feared man was a master of frontier pharmacology. He had spent years studying the botanical wisdom of the land, a science that was often more effective than the snake oil sold in the valley. "Why do you know all this, Silas?" I managed to ask, my voice finally returning. "A man doesn't learn the language of the plants just to hide from people." He paused, his hand resting near the steam of the tea. "I was a student of medicine once back east," he admitted, his eyes fixed on the flickering shadows. "But medicine cannot cure a society that values gold over grace. I chose a different kind of healing up here." The shock of his revelation was as warming as the tea. The man the town called a brute was likely the most educated soul within 100 miles. But just as the color began to return to my cheeks, a thunderous crack echoed from the roof, the sound of a massive pine limb, heavy with ice, threatening to crush the very sanctuary that was keeping us alive. The sound was like a cannon blast. The massive limb of a centuries-old ponderosa pine had succumbed to the weight of the glaze ice. In the high country, ice doesn't just sit on a branch. It builds up in layers, a process known as accretion, until even the strongest wood reaches its breaking point. The cabin shuddered, and dust sifted down from the rafters, but the hand-notched logs held firm. Silas didn't flinch. He looked at the ceiling with a grim appreciation for the structural integrity of his home. "The ridge tests everything," he said softly, returning his focus to the fire. "Your strength, your spirit, and even the wood you choose to build with." As the immediate danger passed, the silence that followed was different. It was an invitation. Now that the secret of his education was out, the air between us felt lighter. I pulled the wool shawl tighter around my shoulders, my strength slowly returning thanks to his willow bark infusion. "Tell me about the man you were before the mountain, Silas," I prodded. "The town told me stories of a monster. You tell me you were a healer. The two don't fit." Silas leaned back, his large frame casting a long shadow against the book-lined walls. He spoke of a life in a bustling city, of marble halls and the high society pressure of a medical practice. He hadn't fled because of a crime or a lack of skill. He had fled because of a loss that medicine couldn't fix. He had lost his young wife to a fever that the city's crowded, unsanitary conditions had only made worse. "I realized then," Silas whispered, "that man-made walls often trap the very sickness they try to keep out. I didn't want to be a doctor for people who lived in filth and called it progress. I wanted to understand the life that exists without us." His journey west wasn't a retreat, it was a search for purity. He had spent years documenting the flora of the high ridge, creating a private herbarium that was likely more complete than any university's collection. He explained that many of our modern understandings of botany come from these solitary observers of the 19th century, men and women who lived among the plants and recorded their cycles with a devotion that bordered on the sacred. As he spoke, the feared man vanished completely. In his place was a guardian of the wilderness. He had protected the pass not to extort the town, but to ensure that those who crossed were prepared for the reality of the heights. He was a gatekeeper of survival. But as the night began to fade into a cold gray dawn, our moment of connection was interrupted. A rhythmic, metallic clinking sounded from far below the ridge. It was the sound of a bell, a distress signal used by travelers lost in the whiteout. Silas stood up, the warmth in his eyes replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. "Someone didn't listen to the mountain," he said, reaching for his heavy fur coat. "And if we don't move now, the ridge will claim them before the sun is up."
The metallic clang of the bell was a desperate plea, muffled by the heavy snowfall but unmistakable. Silas didn't hesitate. He knew that in the high country, a sound like that meant someone was in the final stages of cold fatigue. This is the point where the body has burned through its glucose reserves, trying to generate heat, and the muscles begin to fail. "Stay by the fire, Clara," he commanded. "If I'm not back by the time the sun hits the top of the cedar, bank the coals and wait." He stepped out into the swirling white void. I watched from the window, my heart hammering. In the 1800s, search and rescue wasn't a team of professionals with radios. It was one man with a rope and an intimate knowledge of the terrain. Silas used a technique called dead reckoning, navigating through the zero visibility conditions by feeling the slope of the land beneath his boots and counting his paces. Hours seemed to crawl by. Just as the light began to turn a pale, watery yellow, two silhouettes emerged from the mist. Silas was half carrying a man who looked more like a ghost than a human. They stumbled through the door, bringing a gust of frozen air that made the hearth flames roar. The stranger was dressed in fine wool and polished leather, clothes meant for a city carriage, not a mountain pass. His face was a mask of waxy white patches, a clear sign of superficial frostbite. Silas immediately went to work, but he didn't put the man directly in front of the fire. "Never provide direct heat to frozen skin," Silas explained to me, his voice calm even as he moved with urgency. "It causes the tissue to move too fast, leading to cell rupture. We must use tepid water and the warmth of our own hands." As the stranger began to thaw, he looked around the room, his eyes wide with disbelief. He saw the books, the herbarium, and the carefully crafted furniture. When his gaze finally landed on Silas's face, his breath hitched. "Dr. Sterling?" the man rasped, using a name I had never heard. "Is it really you? We thought you were lost in the Great Fire of '68. Silas froze, a piece of damp cloth in his hand. The stranger was Julian Vane, a prominent surveyor from the coast. He wasn't just a traveler, he was a ghost from Silas's former life. He looked at Silas not with fear, but with a profound, staggering respect. "The world thinks you're a myth, sir, but the papers you wrote on mountain ecology, they are still being taught. You didn't just disappear, you became the foundation of the new science." I looked at my husband, the beast of the ridge, and realized the town hadn't just misunderstood him. They had been living in the shadow of a giant without ever realizing who he really was. Silas didn't look proud, he looked exposed. The world he had left behind had finally scaled his mountain, and the choice he had made to stay hidden was about to be challenged. The silence that followed Julian's revelation was thicker than any mountain fog. Silas, or Dr. Sterling as the world once knew him, simply continued to wrap Julian's frost-bitten hands in clean linen. He didn't confirm the name, but he didn't deny it either. He had spent years building a life of solitude, but the arrival of spring brought more than just melting snow. It brought a choice. As the thaw began, the mountain paths became treacherous. This is the season of ice rafting and mudslides, where the frozen earth turns into a slurry that can move boulders the size of houses. Silas knew the town of Cedar Creek would be in peril. The spring runoff was going to be massive this year due to the Great Freeze, and the valley settlements often lacked the engineering knowledge to prevent devastating floods. "I have to go down," Silas said one morning, looking out over the rushing cataracts of the ridge. "If the creek beds aren't diverted, the mercantile and half the homes will be underwater by sunset." He didn't order me to stay. He simply held out his hand. We began the descent, not as a captive and a captor, but as partners. When we finally reached the outskirts of Cedar Creek, the townspeople gathered on the muddy banks of the rising water. They looked at Silas with the same old fear, clutching their coats and whispering. But Silas didn't go to the tavern or the sheriff. He went straight to the river's bend. He began to direct the men, his voice no longer a whisper, but a command. He taught them the fascine method, an ancient but effective engineering technique using bundles of willow and birch tied together to reinforce the banks and absorb the water's energy. "You're wasting your time, beast," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "That mountain man is just looking to play in the mud while we lose everything." At that moment, Julian Vane stepped forward, still bandaged but standing tall. "This man," Julian announced, his voice carrying over the roar of the water, "is the reason I am alive, and he is the only man in this territory with the mind to save your town. You're not looking at a beast, you're looking at the man who mapped these waters before you even knew they had names." The town fell silent. I stood beside Silas, my hand on his arm, showing them the woman I had become under his care, strong, healthy, and unafraid. We worked through the night, the townspeople following Silas's precise calculations. We weren't just fighting a flood, we were breaking the dam of prejudice that had held this community back for years. By dawn, the water level stabilized. The town was dry. Silas stood on the bank, covered in silt and exhausted, looking at the people who had once traded me away like a piece of property. The shock on their faces wasn't from the flood, it was from the realization that their salvation had come from the very place they feared most.
The crisis had passed, but the air in Cedar Creek had changed forever. As the mud began to dry, the town elders approached us, their hats in their hands. They didn't come with threats or debts. They came with an apology and a plea for Silas to stay and help design a permanent irrigation system for the valley. But Silas simply looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. He had fulfilled the bargain. My father's debt was gone, and the town was safe. He was giving me the choice to stay in the world of society, houses, and noise. But I looked at my hands, once soft and pale, now strong and capable, and I thought of the library in the clouds. I thought of the tinderhoof fungus that carried fire and the white willow that healed the blood. "The valley is where things grow for a season," I said, loud enough for the town to hear, "but the ridge is where things endure." We didn't stay for the celebration. We turned the horses back toward the high ridge. As we climbed, the spring phenology, the study of cyclic biological events, was on full display. The mountain was waking up. We saw the first pasque-flower pushing through the receding snow, a sign that the soil temperature had finally reached the threshold for life. Back at the cabin, the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full. We spent our days documenting the mountain's secrets. Silas taught me how to use a quadrant and a theodolite to map the hidden springs, ensuring that the water would always reach the valley below without the risk of another flood. We weren't just husband and wife, we were stewards of the land. I realized then that I hadn't been traded away to a monster. I had been gifted to a man who saw the world for what it truly was. He hadn't shocked everyone just by being smart or kind. He had shocked them by showing them that redemption isn't found in a ledger, it's found in the courage to be different. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the peaks, Silas took my hand. He didn't say much, but he didn't have to. The man of stone had a heart of gold, and the ridge that was supposed to be my prison had become my home. We weren't the beast and the merchant's daughter, we were the ridgekeepers. And as the stars began to pin themselves to the velvet sky, I knew that as long as the wind whispered through the pines, we would never be alone.
The story of the High Ridge reminds us that the greatest treasures of the Old West weren't always buried in a gold mine. Sometimes they were hidden in the hearts of those the world chose to forget. If you enjoyed this journey of redemption and survival, please hit that like button and subscribe to Rescued by the Ridge. It helps us bring more of these authentic, historical tales to life. I'd love to hear from you. Do you think Silas was right to stay hidden, or should he have shared his gifts with the world sooner? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to check out our playlist for more stories of the mountain men and women who shaped the frontier. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and may your own ridge always lead you home. Be well.